I mean, it's usually something people say of themselves, right? They say, well, I'm apolitical. I'm keeping out of politics here. And of course, a certain kind of leftist response to that, which is my response, is to say, well, hang on a minute, this stance is itself a political stance. You don't want to get involved? Well, that's interestingly indicative of where you stand in politics. There's a certain kind of irony in even just in the use of the term, because as far as I'm concerned, no one's ever actually successful in being apolitical, because we live in a political world, right? That is, we live with other people.
Hello and welcome to Protean View. I'm Riyadh as always, and with me as co-host is Mohammed Bushra, our managing editor at Muftah. We're joined for this episode by Christoph Schuringa. He's a professor of philosophy at Northeastern University in London and the author of a new book that frames much of our discussion. It's titled A Social History of Analytic Philosophy: How Politics Has Shaped an Apolitical Philosophy. Now, you might not know much about analytic philosophy, or maybe you do, but it's often seen even from a distance as a politically neutral or disinterested enterprise. Our upcoming discussion on its recent history and present situation, including crucially the response of philosophy departments to the Gaza genocide, will have a disabusing effect on that misplaced understanding. It's a discussion I think will be of much interest even to those who may know little to nothing about philosophy. And if you want to know more about this topic, including, for example, how the Rand Corporation, of all entities, came to bankroll a number of analytic philosophers in the 20th century, make sure you pick up a copy of the book. It's well worth it. In a moment, you'll hear our discussion with Professor Schuringa, but before that, I want to say a quick thank you to our supporters on Substack and Patreon for helping make this episode possible. And I invite listeners of the show to consider joining our community on Substack at muftah.org and Patreon at patreon.com/ProteanView, which you can do for as low as $5 a month. Whether it's on Substack or Patreon, your monthly contribution gets you a number of benefits. For example, on Patreon, supporters can get a custom coffee mug, and subscribers to our magazine get full access to our archive, among other things. If you're looking to get more involved with the podcast and want to have a greater say in our direction, Patreon is the place for that. With your paid support there, you can get exclusive behind-the-scenes content, early access to episodes, an invitation to our Discord server, and even an ability to select our next guest on the show and what questions we ask them. So if that sounds good to you, visit us at patreon.com/ProteanView, and you can also visit us at muftah.org and subscribe there directly. And don't forget to sign up for our newsletter to stay updated on the latest from us. Thanks for listening and for your support. And here now is our conversation with Christoph Schuringa. I did want to start with a question about your background because I do feel as though that's relevant to the book you've written. Why don't you just start us off by talking about how you came to philosophy? What started your interest in philosophy? Where did you study philosophy? Did you have other interests that might not have been philosophical at the time that you started studying philosophy, that sort of thing?
Yeah, so I came into philosophy really in part from music, which was the great passion of my adolescence. And I wanted to be a pianist and a composer in particular. And that got me into a lot of music theory, like things like theory of harmony and theory of counterpoint. And that led me into aesthetics. So I became very interested in philosophical questions that way. And then also in the kind of school period, a lot of which I actually spent towards the end of it outside of school because I wanted to be a musician, I spent a lot of time studying intellectual history. And that's really what got me into philosophy. So I read, for example, Peter Gay's big 2-volume work about the Enlightenment, and that really grabbed me. And I think partly on that basis, just how much I like the history of ideas, I was then thinking about what I wanted to study. And, I was looking through prospectuses at universities, and I found philosophy to be the thing that really spoke to me, partly because I thought, well, this will be like, the history of ideas. And then I thought, where should I go and study philosophy? And I thought, well, I might as well apply to Cambridge, in Cambridge, England, thinking this was the place where certain great philosophers had been, Bertrand Russell and Ludwig Wittgenstein in particular. And I thought, well, this will be a way of, learning about this tradition and connecting with it. And I imagined it would be like, studying. Basically, my conception of philosophy was the history of philosophy, right? There's great thoughts that people had, one theory leading to another and so on. And I got to Cambridge and it was completely different from that. And that was a really sort of formative experience because what I then found was I was thrown into what I would describe as a kind of extreme form of analytic philosophy, actually, because in the early 2000s, when I went to study there, so Cambridge has always been a very small faculty, and this was true also in the period that I talk about in the book, the period of Russell and G.E. Moore and people like that themselves. There were very few people teaching. There were only 4 people teaching philosophy then. When I was there, a few more than 4, but it was very limited to, the phrase was often doing philosophy. Right? So we weren't there to study what other people had taught, but we were there to do philosophy, to mount our own arguments. And in some ways, I really admire this approach, because the idea is to get students to think for themselves rather than just to defer to authority. But it had this very strange effect that we operated in this completely ahistorical atmosphere and didn't really study the history of philosophy at all. I mean, we read Hume's Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion. We read John Stuart Mill's On Liberty. I mean, 2 interesting texts that you might choose from the sort of British empiricist tradition. A little bit of Plato, but almost none of that. So that was my kind of philosophical formation in a way.
I can relate to so much of that on a number of levels. I did philosophy as an undergraduate as well, and my entry point was also music. As it happens, yeah, I was interested in music theory, and then one thing led to another, and I find myself gravitating toward philosophy. So tell us a little more about your experience at Cambridge. When did you? I mean, you said you didn't really find that you were engaging a lot of questions from a historical viewpoint or a vantage point, which seems par of the course for a lot of analytic philosophy departments. What sort of shifted your attention to history and history of philosophy and history of ideas?
Well, part of what shifted it, or what got me to shift back to this interest, I mean, so insofar as a 17-year-old, you have interests that are so developed, but I was sort of shifted back partly through the influence of a single person, actually, Raymond Geuss, who was one of the people who taught philosophy at Cambridge. And his whole approach to philosophy is very focused on the idea of setting thought in its historical context. And he's very deeply influenced by a person who's also a close friend of his, Quentin Skinner, historian at Cambridge, who's known for always telling his students. And I went to a lot of Skinner's lectures, and they were this sort of delight, this kind of garden of earthly delights to go to as a philosophy student who felt a bit starved at times. These lectures on the history of political thought, where Skinner's point was always, you have to understand what the questions were to which the statements of political philosophers are the answers, right? You have to understand what the problematic is in 17th century England or whenever. You won't get it otherwise. And Geuss, in his lectures on philosophy and history of philosophy, brought this to bear on philosophy and was an extremely exciting and charismatic lecturer. And so in the 3rd year of undergraduate degree, you were allowed to study Hegel, and Nietzsche were the 2 that were allowed on the menu, that made me feel like, okay, I'm back with, the kind of exciting philosophy that had sort of initially grabbed my attention, really.
If I may, I'm wondering from your experience whether, or the extent to which this is really a function of the British Academy specifically, because I had a similar experience. I studied political theory at the LSE, and then I continued my studies. I did my PhD at Georgetown in the US. And the distinction was obviously very stark, because typically political theory in the US is history of ideas, and then they build on that. Whereas at the LSE, it was, to quote a colleague of mine at the time, a degree in John Rawls's theory of justice and its critics. And that's the extent. The only course like pre-Rawls on the menu was actually another Hume course at that time. And that was like just an optional kind of thing that you could opt into. But yeah, I think that it seems that the UK, the approach is very much this kind of doing philosophy.
That's interesting that it's more, in your experience, more restrictive in the UK. I mean, that does fit my impression in the sense that in America, there is just greater diversity still. And it depends on what department and what type of university you're in. But if you look at American universities, there are quite a lot of places of which you could say that they do continental philosophy, which you couldn't really say in the same way of the UK. And there's a sense of competing traditions in the US a bit more. But it's interesting what you say about Rawls. I mean, it's true even of Raymond Geuss in a certain sense, that he's sort of defined by his opposition to Rawls. And for people who are not familiar with the academic scene of political theory, it takes some really explaining to them and convincing them that it's really the case that when you find yourself among political theorists or political philosophers, John Rawls is this sort of saintly figure, and just anything that you say has to be related back to Rawls's Theory of Justice, this book published in 1971. That's almost like a sort of scripture to people. It's very difficult to appreciate from the outside, partly because Rawls is such a sort of unknown figure in the wider culture beyond analytic philosophy and political theory. But yes, it really is that way, isn't it?
One way to read Rawls is that it's this attempt to address the crisis that was facing political philosophy in the 20th century by grounding it in analytic philosophy in a kind of very robust way. And it seems to have had a lasting impact precisely for that reason. As you're saying, people who are responding to him still, either in agreement or, in disagreement, I think that was the thing that somehow reinvigorated political philosophy as a discipline, particularly, again, in the Anglo-American academy.
Yeah, it's an extraordinarily powerful mix of different things, I think, Rawls's theory. And I think if you think about why it captured people's minds and why it continues to exert this sort of power, I think that it's partly, at least two things I think are true of it. One of which is it just corresponds very closely to a certain sort of quite standard bourgeois liberal mindset. And it just tells people back their ideology in a way that's comforting to them. And it's, people feel like they're on home ground. And even the critics feel like, they know what this view is. It's a safe place to start from. It's all very reasonable. It's all about, the supposedly rational subject who isn't really defined by anything in particular, but can pursue whatever project she has. And this is a kind of a marvelous thing. And, what liberal society is all about is allowing people to pursue their projects and giving them the space to do so. And then doing it in this equitable way. It all sounds, very nice and familiar. But there's also this other side to Rawls, I think, which is that he's a kind of iconoclastic, unusual figure who has he had a very specific sort of background that's to do with, being steeped in religion. The young John Rawls was really very guided by his commitment to Christianity and to a really quite theological worldview. And I think this comes out in the sort of, and I don't mean in this in a pejorative sense at all, but a sort of fervor about his philosophizing, which is incredibly sort of powerful to the analytic philosophy mind, because this man has real conviction and he speaks in these sort of different tones. And then there's, the mobilization of game theory, which is exciting in another kind of way. And then he's also doing this other thing, which is also kind of very unusual, which is the resurrection of social contract theory, but in this completely new context. And he's not really an empiricist. He's got this sort of Kantian side to him that makes him, I think, just anyone who comes into contact with Rawls has to realize that he's deeply original and unusual. He gets close. The prose gets close to having a sort of soporific effect in terms of its, sort of the extreme neutrality and the extreme professorial style of exposition and so on, and just how carefully it's all put together. But there is a real sort of drive behind it as well, which I think comes from the Christian dimension and the social contract framework for it, which would have been experienced in the 1970s as sort of deeply unusual.
I don't know if you know who James Goldgeier is. He's a professor of international relations at American University. This discussion about Rawls reminds me of a statement or a little story he once told about his experience with Rawls at Harvard. He was a student of his. He took a class of his. And at the time, he was going around trying to get faculty to sign on to a letter to press Harvard to divest from companies doing business in apartheid South Africa. So he took the letter to Rawls, and Rawls apparently said, I don't get involved in real world issues. He refused to sign on to that. So, odd for the author of A Theory of Justice to say, considering how important his time as a soldier in the Pacific was during the Second World War to the writing of that book, not to mention his activism on behalf of Black Americans during the Vietnam War. But coming back to an earlier point, you mentioned how Rawls's work is a sort of vessel for what you said was bourgeois ideology. I want to get into that, but I think we need to take a step back first and just define terms, because for the uninitiated listener, they're hearing these terms, analytic philosophy, bourgeois ideology. Let's start with analytic philosophy. How do you define it? And maybe by way of defining it, because it's a term that comes up often in conjunction with analytic philosophy, what's its twin, continental philosophy?
Great. Yeah. So one way that I sometimes try to answer this question, what is analytic philosophy, is by characterizing it as the kind of philosophy that's really deeply wedded to, even obsessed with, questions of definition. So analytic philosophers are the kind of people that really care about pinning things down so that you can determine what something is by setting out the necessary and sufficient conditions for it being that thing. So you draw up a list of criteria such that if the thing passes all of these criteria, if the various things that you put through these criteria satisfy them, then you end up with all and only the things, right, that satisfy the definition. I mean, that's a slightly sort of trite way to try and answer it. But I mean, in some sense, there is a tradition, a kind of continuous tradition that I would call analytic philosophy, that has various kind of continuous characteristics, but it's really held together, I think, principally as a kind of social phenomenon, as a grouping that replicates itself across time. And the reason I say that is that it's a sort of part of the self-conception of analytic philosophy, or for a long time was that analytic philosophy was really sort of set in motion by one person, and that was Gottlob Frege, German mathematician, who wrote a short work called Begriffsschrift, which means something like conceptual notation. In 1879, he published this text, and that's often seen as the beginning of analytic philosophy. So what Frege did in that text was to devise a system of formal notation for logic, and principally he was interested in arithmetic and in pure mathematics, but forms of reasoning that would make it visible just at a glance whether or not an argument was valid. And Frege had this very ingenious notation for this kind of two-dimensional notation that no one uses anymore. And the idea is, well, that was the beginning of analytic philosophy. And then you get Bertrand Russell, G.E. Moore, Wittgenstein, the people in Vienna, the Vienna Circle, various people then in America, Quine, Davidson, Kripke, Lewis, people like this. And they all are analytic philosophers. But the trouble is then, you ask, well, what is analytic philosophy exactly? And then the analytic impulse kicks in to really pin the thing down. And of course, it isn't really possible to pin it down. So there's a book by an analytic philosopher called Hans-Johann Glock, which is called What is Analytic Philosophy? And he ends up giving the answer that the various approaches that there are in philosophy that together form analytic philosophy are held together only by what he calls family resemblances, which is a concept from Wittgenstein. So the idea is you can't really do necessary and sufficient conditions. You can't, there's no sort of procedure by which you get only the cases of analytic philosophy and nothing else. But you can see these overlapping relationships between different things that people do. And I actually think that that's just not really true of the reality, because the reality is that analytic philosophers, people who do analytic philosophy, very easily recognize it of each other, that they're analytic philosophers. So they publish in certain journals, they make reference to a certain kind of shared literature which they draw on. And importantly, there's a lot of literature in philosophy that they don't draw on. It isn't even that they argue against it, they simply regard it as outside of philosophy. And so to go to the second part of your question about continental philosophy, a large part of what analytic philosophers take it as their business not to engage with is a group of different streams in 20th century European philosophy that analytic philosophers at some point started to call continental philosophy. So one thing about continental philosophy is there isn't really any such thing in the sense that anyone would define themselves or anyone would have defined themselves as a continental philosopher until a certain point in history where analytic philosophers have domesticated this concept to the point that people actually start self-identifying as continental philosophers because it's just now become a current concept. But basically, movements like in the earlier 20th century, hermeneutics, phenomenology, existentialism, and then later deconstruction. Sometimes people even include critical theory, which is a curious one because in many ways critical theorists are skeptical of the claims of philosophy. But yes, we now have not only philosophers who could be thought of as continental philosophers, and they needn't be from the European continent, they could be from anywhere, but actually self-identify. And so you have MA programs in continental philosophy and journals of continental philosophy and so on. But it's really an umbrella term for movements that in general were in contest with each other as much as they were with what we've come to call analytic philosophy.
So how relevant is the divide in your view today? Because, just thinking about where this division or how this division sort of materializes, you have continental philosophy journals, analytic philosophy journals, that's clear enough. But the divide seems to make a lot of, especially the newer generation of philosophy students, it kind of makes them wince in embarrassment to hear that division these days. They're not really into it, and it hardly comes up in conversation. It's a lot more subtle than that. So in what ways is it still a relevant divide, and in what ways is it maybe not so relevant?
Yeah, we're always being told but that, we should get beyond this distinction or it's no longer really relevant. And it's understandable. People do get bored of it. One thing that people used to say was that there's a quip by the English philosopher Bernard Williams, which was that the distinction between analytic and continental philosophy was what he called a category mistake, which is itself a term from analytic philosopher called Gilbert Ryle. And the idea of a category mistake is that it's not really a genuine contrast because you're cross-classifying across two different kinds of distinction. And he said it's like classifying cars into Japanese and front-wheel drive. And, this is a nice quip. But the problem is the distinction actually is a thing. And I think what's significant about it now, which is the first thing you asked about, is that there is this tendency that's become very entrenched for analytic philosophers to claim that the distinction no longer really holds, or that it's, old news and we've moved beyond it and so on. And it does often seem that way from the perspective of analytic philosophers. But the reason it seems that way is that analytic philosophy is now in a mood of rapprochement, in a kind of mood of lessened hostility towards the other and the outsider, which it had been sort of fantasizing about, this continental philosophy, this great threat. It's true, and it's really true that analytic philosophers are much less worked up about this and that they're more relaxed. But the reason for that is that analytic philosophy has really managed in a quite spectacular way to make headway into the territory of the opponent of continental philosophy by themselves studying continental philosophers and sort of repackaging them and reformatting them, sort of analyticizing them. So, a while back it was analytic Nietzsche, which is, in a sense, if you think about it, a really, really strange phenomenon. What is Nietzsche's account of compassion? What are the necessary and sufficient conditions for compassion? Well, difficult thing to get out of Nietzsche without doing real violence to the text, but people started to do this. Then there was analytic Heidegger, we're now at the stage of analytic Derrida, like sort of anything's possible. So I think the real significance of the divide is that it is still there, and that there's a sort of masking of the divide, which I think we should be very wary of, because it's, as I say in my book, I think it's a form of colonization. All right, what it does is it absorbs something that had been sort of outside the colonial space, of a certain kind of thinking into itself, so that, as happens with colonialism, there is no longer any outside. So you can't say, oh, these are people that are being, colonized over, because they're just, subjects or citizens within some realm. And they're perfectly free to come and go as they please. I mean, if you really look at it, maybe their effective rights are slightly different, but there are no grounds for complaint anymore from the continental side, and I find that almost quite frightening. That notion that you could take people's voices away from them by having always already made them speak in the voice of the colonial master, so to speak.
You were talking about Rawls as being a vessel for sort of bourgeois liberal ideology, right? So what do you mean by bourgeois liberal ideology, and why is analytic philosophy, in your view, a vessel for it?
Well, there's an old idea that liberalism is the ideology of the bourgeoisie, right? As an idea, it used to be widely disseminated, and so, I mean, thinking about it that way, the bourgeoisie is what becomes established as the ruling class in the wake of the French Revolution. What liberalism promotes is the idea of a certain kind of equality among subjects. And a key to this, which really comes out in Rawls in a really beautiful kind of, really focused way, is the idea of individual subjects being neutral, in the sense that, you or I are in some sense completely interchangeable with these sort of neutral extensionless points that are kind of vantage points on the world that have attached to them a will and a mind, which each of us can sort of shape as we see fit, in response to a world that's given to us. So, I mean, as I understand liberalism, you very quickly have to connect it with sort of its other side, which is empiricism. So liberalism has a kind of conception of the human subject as each of us is equal. Sure, each of us has our own idiosyncratic identities, but these don't really matter because it's a kind of juridical conception, right? Each of us is sort of equal before the law. But the other side to this is the idea that the world is just there to be given to us as these subjects, for us to receive receptively. So I think one of the most vivid expressions of this is in the work of the American philosopher David Lewis, who writes in the preface to a collection of his published papers that he regards the world to be, and I think he doesn't use this phrase here, but it's the phrase that's often used to characterize this view, as a Humean mosaic. And what he does say in that preface, the phrase that he uses is, he says, it's just one little thing after another. And so the conception of the world is that there it all is, right, laid out as a set of, you could think of it in different ways. Facts, facts that are just inertly given, or we could think of it in terms of the array of material objects or particles or whatever it is. But in any case, the conception of the world as just sort of given to us, and then it's up to the liberal subject, which is the other pole of this subject-object, right, to make of it what they will, and to go to work on it in such a way that, it's all a matter of what you do, as Kant would put it, spontaneously. So Kant is another inheritor of this view, in whom sort of different facets of it come out. But in Kant, there's this enormous emphasis placed on our power of spontaneity, right? What we bring to the world. So Kant's practical philosophy, which is the really kind of leading part of his philosophy, is all about how it's up to us to be the expressions of the highest form of rationality, and to hold our own in this world in a way that, it's a kind of secular residue of a Christian view, in that before, and Kant very much came from this background because he was a Lutheran of a quite strong kind. He was a pietist. you get the idea of being commanded by God, by a set of sort of absolute commands that have their hold on us, but you secularize out the role of God. I mean, God's still there, but known in a different way, and so on. We get rid of the sort of absolutist conception of the deity, and instead it's all down to us, right? It's all down to the autonomous human subject. So that's the sense in which I think. Well, that's the sense in which I think about liberal ideology. It's a thing that inherently has these sort of two poles to it. So sometimes I use this phrase in the book, empiricism, liberalism, just with a hyphen, because I think that they go together.
I was going to ask about, again, going back to this question about the divide between analytic and continental, and this idea of colonizing the continental side. I wanted to ask about this in relation to when we talk about continental philosophy. Again, there's this idea that this is just something that comes out of Germany and France in particular, and when in reality, if we just look at it in terms of both genealogy and in terms of dissemination, so much of that happens in the US Academy, especially in terms of proliferation of these ideas and further development of them. And of course, part of it is, yes, people like Marcuse being based in the US and having students and these ideas being picked up and so on. But then also, we obviously know of the, Cold War sponsorship of these ideas and bringing them into the US Academy, particularly, as a Cold War tactic. So maybe if we can speak somewhat to that, both in terms of the kind of blurring line between the kind of analytic departments that are hosting these people and the dissemination and further development of these ideas, but also, apt perhaps to talk about colonialism when we're talking about it in the context of warfare and strategic thinking of countering threats and so on.
Were you thinking, sorry, just to clarify, were you thinking of the importation of continental philosophy ideas into America as part of the Cold War effort, in the sense
yes, because I think that there seems to be some, solid evidence of this.
Yeah.
So yeah, just following those two trails, both in terms of even apart from that, just the people think of continental and there's this naive view of, okay, this is just something from Europe by, it's in the name, when in reality, so much of what we think of continental philosophy today is something that actually is coming out primarily of the American Academy.
Yeah. So there's certainly a way in which continental philosophy, so-called, is kind of packaged in the American Academy that's really distinctive, and that's the way in which it's been primarily consumed. And I think that's absolutely right. And certainly somebody like Derrida, made an extraordinary impact in the United States at this one conference at Johns Hopkins, which has become legendary, and so on. And there's a whole sort of Derridean industry that comes from that, and it has all sorts of interesting and ironic features. But the question about the use of continental philosophy and continental philosophers as part of the Cold War effort, I think this is a very, very interesting one, and it's not something that I actually talk about in my book, partly because there was a great deal to cover in about 300 pages, and it's already an enormous amount. And I really focused on the way in which the American, economic industrial situation encourages the funding of essentially the analytic side in this sort of conflict with what had been the other streams in an incredibly diverse philosophical landscape, actually, in America. So one thing I hadn't really realized until doing work on the book was that in America, not only was there an enormous variety of different kind of approaches to philosophy that were going on, let's say in sort of 1945, it had been inherited from before the Second World War, but even into the 50s, it took a really long time for analytic philosophy to take over even the main elite departments. So, for example, Chicago and Yale were actually very slow because they had all these other people in them who were either kind of grand speculative metaphysicians, or they were interested in all sorts of other things, like contemporary Indian philosophy was a really big thing in America still in this period. That all gets gradually pushed out. And so my focus was really on the way in which analytic philosophy, which only really begins as a really self-conscious formation in this environment in America, in the United States after 1945, how the cultural conditions, and particular conditions of McCarthyism, made it a very hospitable environment for that pushing through to happen. And partly that's to do with the pushing out of radical Marxist philosophers. I mean, that it doesn't take much to see that those people were in a very weak position when it came to vulnerability to McCarthyite persecution. And, there are the stories of what actually happened to some of those people. But more widely, there's this enormous culture of this climate of fear, which means that everyone's constantly watching what they're saying. And it's relatively easy for analytic philosophy to win out in that context. But there's also this further thing, which you mentioned, which is, the use of continental philosophy by the CIA and by, for example, through the funding of publications like the magazine Encounter in the UK, which is a CIA-sponsored outlet, where the idea was to kind of promote certain forms of continental so-called thought or leftist thought in order to provide a certain kind of cultural consensus about what this type of thinking should look like or could amount to, so that it was ensured that it was more palatable than what some other people might say. So that's an interestingly very complicated, front in the ideological war against Soviet Marxism, essentially.
Can we come back to the question of analytic philosophy being apolitical, just briefly? I know we touched on it a little bit, but I had maybe one or two more questions about it. First, what exactly does it mean for analytic philosophy to be apolitical? All right. There are obviously a number of figures that we generally associate with the analytic tradition or the style of analytic philosophy, from more well-known figures like, say, Bertrand Russell or Rudolf Carnap, to even, there are some lesser-known figures that you discuss in the book, like Donald Kalish, right? Mm-hmm. They were all politically active to varying degrees. And some of them, like Otto Neurath, he thought, his philosophical and political work, there was this intimate connection between his philosophical and political work. So there's the sense in which some uninitiated listener or reader might say, well, hang on, there are all of these analytic philosophers that are clearly politically active, and so on. So what do you mean by apolitical here? Situate it for us.
Well, apolitical is something that people, it's usually something people say of themselves, right? They say, well, I'm apolitical. I'm keeping out of politics here. And of course, a certain kind of leftist response to that, which is my response, is to say, well, hang on a minute. This stance is itself a political stance. You don't want to get involved? Well, that's interestingly indicative of where you stand in politics. So that's the kind of sense in which I'm using the term. So I'm using it in a sort of, there's a certain kind of irony in even just in the use of the term, because as far as I'm concerned, no one's ever actually successful in being apolitical, because we live in a political world, right? That is, we live with other people, and whether you like it or not, some of those other people are in a position to make decisions about how things are to be run, or who goes to war against whom, or whatever it happens to be, and they do it on our behalf, and we might want to disengage from it, but it doesn't make us apolitical. So now your question about these figures that sort of jump out of the story of analytic philosophy in a certain way because they had vociferous political commitments. I think there's something different to be said about some of the earlier figures than about the later ones. So, and by earlier, I mean basically pre-Second World War. And that reflects that, without getting into the minutiae too deeply, but for me, the story of analytic philosophy is kind of in two parts, right? There's what happens before the Second World War, in which there's a set of quite distinct movements, actually, that are methodologically self-conscious and that separate themselves off from each other and are in contestation with each other. So, for example, what happens in Cambridge is very distinct from what the logical positivists are doing in Vienna. They subscribe to quite different doctrines, and even methodologically they're quite different. And it's only after the Second World War that you get a sort of amalgamation of these movements into what then becomes known as analytic philosophy, and it's much more like a sort of mushy, there's a sort of mushy oneness to this formation, even though actually methodologically, so in terms of what people think philosophy is or what they're doing in philosophy, there's very, very little disagreement. So it's a strange kind of unity. But sort of bearing that in mind, figures like, so Bertrand Russell, complicated political trajectory, but quite early on, he was interested in Marxism, and he went to Berlin and he met the leaders of the Social Democrat Party at the time, which at the time was still a Marxist party, and wrote, his first book was called German Social Democracy, and it's quite an interesting treatment of the people that he met and their ideas. And he comes out in the end sort of quite liberal, but it's not at all, it's not like he has no sympathy or no understanding of these ideas. And late on in his career, again, he goes quite far left. So I think in Russell's case, actually, philosophically, he isn't particularly left-wing. So I think there's a kind of separation between what goes on philosophically, which is a sort of empiricism, liberalism kind of thing, except for the very early work where he's doing other things. But he sort of collapses back into a native tradition, which is the tradition of empiricism and liberalism, as I understand him. Neurath, I think, is different, because for Neurath, there is this complete sort of unity between his project in the epistemology of science, which went under the name of the unity of science, by which they meant there's just one type of inquiry, respectable rational inquiry, and that's empirical inquiry. So all sciences are unified in that sense, that they're all empirical. And then this went together for him sort of indissolubly with a project of universal housing, universal education, what he called full socialization. Right? Everything was to be socialized. And he participated in the government of the Bavarian Soviet Republic, which only lasted for a couple of weeks, but he was involved in that. So Neurath is different. But after the war, after the Second World War, even the people who'd come from Vienna, who had been radical, or fairly radical leftists. No one as radical as Neurath, right, who died during the war. But the ones who made it over, like Carnap, for example, was reasonably far on the left. The political dimension completely gets squeezed out from these people, and I think that's really remarkable. So they no longer do this kind of work in which a philosophy of science is indissolubly linked with a radical social project. It's just not part of it anymore. So I think from that period onwards, you do still see people who are politically active on the left, but it's pretty much disconnected from their philosophical work. So someone like Hilary Putnam, who was a Maoist, Donald Kalish, whom you mentioned, who's a very interesting figure because he really stood up for Angela Davis during the whole saga about her being fired from UCLA. She was fired twice, and he really stood up for the philosophy department as against the higher sort of management of the university. He was a sort of canny communist because he'd, when he was questioned by McCarthyite committees, he sort of he didn't entirely disown his communist past, but dissociated himself, for example, from the ideas of Karl Marx, which was one way to, in some sense, save his skin. But yeah, it's certainly true, and that there have been people, and there continue to be people who are political activists, even. Someone like Michael Dummett, who was one of the great interpreters of the work of Frege, philosopher at Oxford, was very heavily involved with activism against immigration restrictions in the UK, and was a big anti-racism campaigner. And that there's no doubt that Dummett was extremely committed to that. I don't think it shows anywhere in his strictly philosophical work.
I'm curious to know where you think analytic philosophy departments are going in the future. You say in the book that a lot of analytic philosophers in the 20th century were sort of implicated in the reproduction of the status quo. And you give an interesting example with G.E. Moore to justify that point. Maybe by way of talking about the example of G.E. Moore, you could talk about how you think contemporary departments continue in that tradition, differ from that tradition. Where do you think analytic philosophy is going in the future?
Well, of course, it's a very different world from the world of G.E. Moore. But I think there is a structural point of similarity. So, I mean, what I say about Moore is basically something that was noticed by John Maynard Keynes, the economist, who was one of his contemporaries and knew him very well, was part of the same circle of Bloomsbury intellectuals. Moore was very good at telling a certain part of the intellectual and artistic elite of Britain, the sorts of things that they like to hear, which was that. So, for example, one of the things that comes out at the end of Principia Ethica, Moore's great work, which was hailed by one person as I think this was Lytton Strachey, as the opening of a new heaven upon earth. People really talked in this sort of way about this book. They were very enthusiastic. And one reason they were so enthusiastic was that it ends by saying that the best things in human life are a certain kind of polite conversation between friends and the contemplation of beautiful artworks and the sorts of things that Bloomsbury stood for. So Moore was very good at this sort of feeding back of what people wanted to hear to them, and it was done by means of a whole theory of intuition that undergirds how morality works, right? So morality is all about knowing the good, and the good is the special thing. It's a non-natural property which you can know by intuition. Well, very quickly then you get to having intuitive access to these things that will seem rather obvious if you're a Bloomsbury intellectual, which is the kinds of things that Bloomsbury intellectuals value are extremely valuable. So, I mean, to apply that to the current case, and even though it's a very, very different world, I mean, now in a sense, we're in an environment where university departments are so much more subject to sort of infiltration by the demands of the culture and government and corporations, that it makes Cambridge of the early 20th century look almost like a sort of idyllic scholar's retreat or something, untouched by the world. But now, there's great pressure on philosophers to do the bidding of the AI industry, become experts in AI ethics. And as philosophers, I think we still know, somewhere we still have this knowledge that ethics isn't really about, conforming to regulations, but ethics is about, deep principles of the right and wrong. But it quickly becomes that. And I think, as a sort of deeper conceptual point, if you operate conceptually in a space where, it's just a question of determining what's what, giving what analytic philosophers call accounts of various kinds of things, without the great sort of critical bite that comes from a deep engagement with history, with culture, with mechanisms of power of various kinds and so on, all the sorts of things that make analytic philosophy tend towards the bloodless and the purely abstract and so on. It's not long before you end up reinforcing the status quo and giving those who uphold the status quo back what it is that they want from you.
Have you read Liam Coffey Bright's famous blog on the end of analytic philosophy? He published it a few years ago, and it sort of made the rounds.
Yeah. He calls it, I think, a degenerating research program.
Yes, he does. I think he draws that phrase from Lakatos, or he appropriates it from Lakatos. But as you said, institutionally, analytic philosophy doesn't necessarily seem to be going anywhere. Not sure if Bright takes that same position exactly. He seems to suggest that it's changing, but it's also still there in the sense that there's nothing to replace it. But there's this eagerness for change, and you can see it in this, what he calls like an applied turn, where a lot of new PhD students coming in are focused on questions of social and political philosophy. But it seems like his view is that the reason that there's no change departmentally is that there's no what he calls a successor paradigm. I don't know maybe you could just comment on that. What's your take here?
Yeah, but I think there's long been a successor paradigm. People just don't want to see it. I mean, I don't know if this is Liam's view exactly, but this point that, philosophy isn't really going anywhere. Things are in this sort of state of disarray. And okay, there's some interest in social questions, but this doesn't really touch the core. I mean, that point's been used against me in interesting ways, as if, yes, there's a lot of disarray, but we should be more sort of pessimistic or even sort of nihilistic about this because because philosophy has no real influence or power, or it doesn't really capture people's minds anyway. It's all degenerating, and I think that's actually kind of profoundly wrong because philosophy does have a certain kind of status in the academy. If you look at, take an example, Oxford University, a fairly important contributor to, what ends up happening in the UK in terms of how people's lives are run for them. The program in philosophy, politics, and economics, very, very popular program. It's the place that almost all the politicians that have held high office in this country have come out of. There's a normalization of a certain kind of conception of philosophy, even if the people that come out of it aren't that particularly philosophical in their orientation, or it's maybe not the focus of their interest. It's still there working away. Philosophy is this set of questions. Philosophy is parceled up. Analytic philosophy sort of parcels things up into whether are the metaphysical problems and the epistemological problems and the ethical problems and the political. And each of these is just a sort of pre-given puzzle that's there for you to solve. And you have to use the right argumentative tools and, objection, counter-objection, I'm not disparaging this stuff. I think it's really great for people to learn, how to argue, how these things work. Sometimes I think it's, something that's really, really, really appropriate for kind of, high school and beginning undergraduates, and, this kind of, mental hygiene that it encourages is a really good thing. But then there's a next step, which is the examination of like our own historical situation and the formation of our subjectivity, and who are we, and who are we asking these questions, and how can we be critical of the way in which the answers to questions are manufactured or imposed on us or circulated in the media, all this sort of thing, which I think critical thinking, so-called, which is a kind of analytic philosophy light in a way, just has very little purchase on, because we just go round and round asking the same questions without really the resources that come from things that analytic philosophy, for example, has taken on, like critical race theory, which had as its one of its core components was the storytelling movement. And the idea of storytelling was there's a way that people who've had certain experiences, for example, at the hands of the juridical industrial complex, are able to tell their stories, are able to talk about them in such a way that people who haven't had those experiences need principally to listen. And they're placed differently as subjects. Once you bring that into the realm of analytic philosophy, that whole dimension has to disappear because it can't be made sense of. Because I'm a person, you're a person, so and so's a person. We're all equal with respect to our ability to engage in the game. Because the conditions of entry to the game are just can you put a counter argument. There aren't any conditions of entry to the game that have to do with how your experience is structured and how you're able to communicate that to others.
This is a good point to ask about the recent response of philosophy professors to the Gaza genocide. So on the one hand, it was somehow the most responsive academic discipline, but at the same time, generally quite bad, limiting, and disappointing perhaps. Philosophers aren't generally known to take to the limelight when it comes to public issues like this. The kind of last example we can think of in this regard perhaps was the Iraq War, in which the response was pretty poor. So what changed this time that at the very least, there has been somewhat of a response, but then also the limitations of it, that it seems to kind of end at making statements and kind of leaving it at that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm even slightly surprised that you think that there's as much positive to say about it as you just said, because it's I mean, there's just a sort of deafening silence, it seems, from where I'm sitting, and then sort of laced with some of the very strange effects that you get when the only contribution really is letter writing. And I'm maybe less skeptical now than I was a year ago about the merits of writing such letters, just because of the level of reluctance to do even that. And so in a way, by default, it starts to count for more than one would have thought, that people would put their signatures to letters. But you get these very disturbing effects, which is that you then get counter letters. So like the affair that happened in Germany, and it's unfair in a certain way to focus on Germany, but I'm inclined to do so anyway, because it's just such an egregious and disturbing case. The response of Jürgen Habermas and some of his associates to even the idea that the genocide that's occurring in Gaza could be described as a genocide, and the immense pressures that are being put on German academics on the basis often that Germany has some sort of, implicitly I think it's thought that Germany has some sort of special place in this because of its own history. And when one really thinks that through, there's something just extraordinarily disturbing about the idea that being the descendants of the people who committed the genocide that occurred between 39 and 45 are in some special position to arbitrate who should designate what as a genocide, seems extremely perverse. I did reflect quite recently on this because I was doing a little bit of research on kind of where continental philosophy is at the moment, because I was taking part in a discussion of, it was billed as the future of European philosophy, and I watched a lecture by Ray Brassier, who, so for one thing, is situated in Beirut, so that may be one factor in it. But he began the lecture, which was about something completely different, by talking about the genocide in Gaza, and it was sort of, it had, in a sense, sort of disproportionately powerful effect that he was even talking about this thing that was happening, not that far from where he was speaking. But yeah, so I'm shocked and sort of, I don't know, don't know what else to say other than that it's just extraordinarily striking that we now have a genocide that's being played out, live on TV, and one of the places that intellectuals go is to still debate about whether that thing that they're seeing happening is happening, given the level of agreement that exists now.
Perhaps this brings it back to definitions and sufficient conditions, isn't it?
Absolutely, and it tells you where that kind of discussion can end up.
I think we have just a couple of more questions in closing about the structure of the book, or not so much the structure, but the method, say, of the book. So you mentioned in the book that you're pursuing a social history of analytic philosophy, not a sociology of knowledge. What do you mean by that? Because it's not necessarily clear to the reader at first glance what the difference is. And then also, how does your work differ from that of someone like Thomas Akehurst, who is similarly surveying the say, cultural landscape and political landscape of analytic philosophy in the 20th century?
Yeah, so the way I understand sociology of knowledge and in particular something that I think has been called the strong program in sociology of knowledge, is that the method is basically to focus on the production of knowledge and to think about what the mechanisms of production are in particular. And while doing that, more or less, this is a bit of a caricature, but sort of more or less bracketing out the knowledge itself that's produced, or the ideas that are produced. So the idea is really, really focus on the mechanisms of production, their nature, their material conditions, and so on. And I think that can be very valuable in some areas. I think in the case of philosophy, it's bound to be very unpromising. And I think it's one reason why the social history of philosophy is something that hasn't been very much done. So a great exception to this is the work of Martin Kusch, who wrote a book called Psychologism, which I think is a sort of landmark in the genre of sociology of philosophical knowledge. But on the whole, people haven't done it because it's very difficult to talk about the production of a philosophical idea without really getting into what the idea is. So I decided to take quite a different approach, which is to try and explain the ideas, and in doing so, give quite a lot of airtime to the ideas themselves in a way that sort of makes it palpable to the reader how it might be that the way to understand, in particular, the reproduction and the spread and the sort of passing on of certain kinds of ideas and the reinterpretation across time as well, by thinking of what's going on to shape all of this as being ideology. So something I also really wanted to avoid is the idea of a sort of causal explanation where the idea is that there's a kind of bedrock of material and institutional mechanisms and so on, and that there's a kind of upward causal explanation of then the ideas as a kind of epiphenomena. And I should have maybe been more explicit about this. What I didn't want to do is go into kind of enormous methodological sort of explanations at the beginning of the book in case it sounded sort of defensive or off-putting or boring. But not surprisingly, a lot of analytic philosophers have responded to the book on the basis of an expectation, which is they think that for it to be a social history, it would have needed to have involved this type of causal explanation because that's the way that they understand the production of the social world. Right? Now, the contrast with Akehurst, I think, is really more of a contrast of scopes than anything, because what Akehurst does, I think, very interestingly and very well, is to talk about what he calls a cultural politics and really of British philosophy, and the British phenomenon is distinct, and he is very much focused on that. What he does essentially is to unmask, in a way, the role played by fundamentally anti-European ideas that circulated in Britain, and the way in which they're used to sort of bolster the sense of the legitimacy of a certain kind of philosophical project. For example, the work of A.J. Ayer, British logical positivist, or Stuart Hampshire, who was closely involved with the sort of shoring up of liberalism after the Second World War in Britain, and various others. And so I think Akehurst does that very effectively. But the reason I say scope is that I wanted my story to be not just about that type of cultural politics, largely because there's a risk that one could make it sound like that's the whole story, right? So you could end up with a story where it sounds like, well, Bertrand Russell was interested in certain ideas or pushed them, or A.J. Ayer pushed certain ideas because of their power in a certain kind of culture war. In a very broad sense of culture war, there's a sort of cultural war with the European continent. And I think the risk there is that it can end up sounding like, well, that's all that there is to these ideas. Is they're just sort of props in some other war, they're part of kind of intellectual proxy war. And that's not how I understand the history of British philosophy or the history of analytic philosophy more generally, because I think that just like any other movement in philosophy, in large part people are driven by the power of the ideas. That doesn't exclude that the power of those ideas is partly constituted by their ideological function. But they're not, it's not that they're explained away by their power to intervene in a certain kind of political, cultural contest that isn't actually itself philosophical. Like Margaret Thatcher's obsession with the idea that all dangerous ideas came from the continent of Europe. Like, sure, certain things that philosophers say serve that, but that's not all that there is to those ideas.
Okay, we'll have to leave it there. Christoph, thank you.
Thank you so much. It's been a great pleasure talking to you.
And to our listeners, we do hope you enjoyed this episode, and we welcome your comments, feedback, and suggestions. Do send us an email at proteanview@muftah.org. Whether you are tuning in on Apple, Spotify, or YouTube, we'd really appreciate a 5-star review or a like. This helps improve the visibility of our show. With your support, we can keep Protean View running and gradually improve it. Visit us at muftah.org and navigate to the Protean View tab to see all our episodes. And follow us on our socials using the handle @ProteanView, including on Patreon, where you can become a paid patron and receive exclusive content. Until next time.